Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're taking a close look at the Dutch government, specifically Geert Wilders' PVV party,
Mm.
and the challenges they've faced since leading the formation of that coalition about a year back.
Yeah, and we've really dug through a stack of material, articles, notes, research, the kind of stuff that helps you get, past the daily headline.
Exactly. Our mission here is to understand how this government even came together, why the PVV, the biggest party, has actually seen its support drop, and what this first year tells us about, well, the sheer difficulty of governing.
Especially for a party like the PVV, relatively new to this level of power. And the sources, they really uncover some surprising details. Policy fights, internal rows.
Yeah, and wider political trends affecting them too. Okay, so how did we actually get here? Let's start there.
Right. It all kicks off with the November 2023 election. The PVV, Wilders' party, won 37 seats out of 150. Big win.
Huge win. Made them the largest party for the first time, right? Ended that long VDD dominance.
Absolutely. And Wilders campaigned hard on, well, familiar themes, anti-Islam, anti-immigration, Euroscepticism, that whole idea of the Dutch get their country back.
Yeah, very direct platform. But winning seats is one thing, forming a government. That turned out to be a whole different challenge, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. A major hurdle right off the bat was reluctance from other key parties on the right. Think VDD, the center-right NSC.
And why were they hesitant? Just the controversial views?
That was part of it, sure. But the sources also point to real concerns about trust, and maybe the PVV's readiness to handle things like public finances properly.
Okay. And that actually stalled things, didn't it? Talks collapsed.
They did. Early February, the NSC just walked away, looked like it might be dead in the water.
So what brought them back? How did they salvage it?
Well, that's when Wilders made a really significant move, a big concession. He publicly announced he would not aim to be prime minister himself.
Ah, okay. That must have been key.
It seems it was crucial, really, for getting those reluctant parties, especially NSC, back to the negotiating table.
But even then, it wasn't quick. Took a long time.
A very long time. About 6 months of negotiations before they finally hammered out an agreement in May.
And the final lineup. Who actually formed the coalition?
It's a four-party deal. Wilders' PVV, the VVD, NSC, and the Farmer Citizen Movement, the BBB.
Right. And to get that deal, Wilders had to compromise quite a bit, I gather.
Yeah, reports say he dropped some of his, let's say, most radical policy ideas, things like banning the Quran or mosques, and also had to scale back some spending plans, like free public transport.
So compromises just to get started. And the prime minister isn't Wilders, it's Dick Scoof, former civil servant.
Correct. He leads what some sources call an extra-parliamentary cabinet, though the exact setup was still a bit fuzzy in the details we saw.
Okay, so that's the backstory, how they got into power. But now, looking at where things stand, maybe a year or so after that election, the sources suggest it's not exactly smooth sailing.
Not really, no. The polls are probably the clearest sign. PVV support has dropped significantly.
How much?
About 10 percentage points down from their peak. They hit 33% last April. Now they're quite a bit lower. They've lost that lead position in the polls.
Wow, 10 points is a big dip. And I saw a March survey mentioned something about public confidence.
Yeah, that one was striking. Only 1 in 6 voters felt confident in the government. Just 10% thought the policies were actually good.
Ouch. What do the sources say about why voters are feeling this way, even supporters of the coalition parties?
Well, what's really telling, I think, is the VVD voter sentiment. One report said half of VVD supporters think their party should actually team up with the opposition next time the Green Left Labor Alliance.
Half. That's huge. Shows a real disconnect.
It really does. And recent projections actually have that Green Left Labor Alliance basically tied with the PVV in potential seats now.
Quite the turnaround in a year. So what's the main driver, according to the polls, for this PVV slide specifically? Is it just one thing?
The sources seem pretty consistent on this. It's this perception that the PVV hasn't delivered on its promises beyond immigration.
Ah, okay, so immigration was the big campaign issue,
Yeah.
but people expected action elsewhere too.
Exactly. Voters seem to be looking for progress on other big domestic problems, and, well, they're just not seeing it happen.
Right, okay, let's dive into one of those major domestic issues the sources flagged. The housing crisis. How bad is it there?
It's described as one of the most severe in Europe, really serious. Estimates are they need something like 390,000 new homes. Massive shortage.
Wow. And the government's proposed solution? What's the plan?
Well, their main proposal right now focuses just on social housing rents. That's the affordable housing run by nonprofits. They're proposing a 2-year freeze on rent increases.
A rent freeze. On the surface, that sounds like it could help people struggling with costs. But you mentioned backlash.
Major backlash, yeah. Critics are basically saying it's a superficial fix, a Band-Aid.
Why? Doesn't it help tenants?
Well, the argument is it completely ignores the fundamental problem, which is a lack of supply. The coalition talked about building more homes, but this rent freeze doesn't do that. Some see it as, a distraction or maybe even worse.
Worse. How could it be counterproductive?
The big worry is it could actually slow down the building of new homes.
How so?
Because the housing corporations, the ones managing social housing, who are already in legal fights with the government over other regulations, by the way, they'd get less income from frozen rents. Less income means, well, less money to invest in building new properties.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think I saw something about it potentially leading to houses being sold off too.
Exactly right. The fear is these corporations might sell more of their existing houses to make up for the lost rental income.
Which reduces the affordable housing stock even further.
Precisely. Pushes more people into the private rental market, potentially driving up demand and prices there. It's a tricky situation.
So the plan's getting flack from all sides, it sounds like. Politically, does it even have a chance of passing?
Well, this is interesting. The coalition doesn't actually have a majority in the Senate, the upper house. They need opposition votes.
And the opposition likes the plan.
Not according to the sources. They report opposition parties have pretty much dismissed it. Called it a stupid idea, apparently.
Okay, so passage seems unlikely then.
Highly unlikely. And if, or perhaps when, it fails, it'll be seen as a pretty big policy defeat for the government, and especially for the PVV. It just reinforces that narrative about them failing to deliver.
Right. So beyond these policy struggles, like housing, the sources also talked about infighting, clashes within the coalition itself.
Yes, quite a bit. There was that notable resignation back in November. Junior Minister Nora al-Sabar from the NSC party.
What happened there?
It was around the time of some violent clashes involving football fans, I believe, but she explicitly cited alleged racist comments made by other ministers in a cabinet meeting as her reason for leaving.
Wow, that points to some serious underlying tension.
It definitely highlighted those early worries some had about trust and, the fundamental differences between these coalition partners.
And there was a more recent public spat, too, wasn't there? Something about Israel.
Yeah, that's right. The foreign minister asked the EU to review its association agreement with Israel. That's the main pact governing EU-Israel trade and relations.
Why?
Citing concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Oh, okay. And Wilder's reaction, I imagine he wasn't pleased.
Pleased is not the word. He publicly slammed it, called it ridiculous anti-Israel measures, and he specifically complained his party wasn't consulted, even sort of questioning if the foreign minister was really his minister.
Strong words. How did the prime minister handle that?
PM Scoof came out and publicly backed his foreign minister, said Wilder's approval simply wasn't needed for that kind of foreign policy decision.
So a direct public disagreement between the leader of the largest coalition party and the prime minister. That's unusual.
Highly unusual. Especially on such a sensitive topic, it really shows deep divisions. And what's also interesting is that public opinion in the Netherlands seems to be shifting a bit on this.
Shifting how?
Well, historically, the Dutch stance on Israel has been relatively soft, diplomatically. But reports show more people oppose that now, 27%, up from 19% back in September. And over half, 54%, actually want a more critical approach from the government.
So Wilder's strong pro-Israel stance might be increasingly out of step with a growing portion of the public.
Potentially, yeah. Adds another layer of complexity.
So we've got policy failures, resignations, public clashes. The sources also mentioned Wilder's has a bit of a history of using, let's say, strong-arm tactics.
Yes, the sources definitely point to a pattern.
Yeah.
He's apparently used the threat of blowing up the government or pulling his party out several times to try and force his agenda, especially on immigration and asylum.
Like what? Any examples?
Well, last October, he apparently tried to get a nationwide state of emergency declared so he could push through tougher asylum rules without needing Parliament's okay.
It's a state of emergency. Wow.
Yeah. And then again in February, reports say he threatened to withdraw the PVV if his specific asylum law changes weren't adopted. So it seems to be a recurring tactic.
Okay. So putting it all together, failure to deliver on non-immigration promises, the housing plan likely failing, internal fights, these threats. It sounds like a pretty rough first year.
That's certainly the picture painted by the sources. They argue this combination has really damaged the PVV's credibility, their image of effectiveness, in the eyes of many voters. And that feeds directly into those falling poll numbers we talked about.
So the big question then is, Looking forward, can they actually turn this around? Can the PVV regain that peak popularity they had right after the election?
Based on what the source material suggests, looking at broader trends, it looks, well, challenging. Quite challenging.
What kind of broader trends are we talking about?
The sources highlight a potential trend across Northern Europe, places like Denmark, Norway, Sweden. It seems support for more mainstream left-wing parties might be ticking upwards there.
Interesting. Why?
The analysis suggests voters might be shifting back towards more established, maybe perceived as more stable parties, possibly driven by worries about global instability, economic downturns, that sort of thing.
Okay, so a potential shift towards the established left in the region.
Mm.
How does that connect back to Wilders and the PVV in the Netherlands?
Well, one factor the sources bring up is anti-Trump sentiment. It's noted as being very high across Europe right now.
And specifically in the Netherlands?
Yeah, the Dutch data cited shows 60% of people there see Trump as an enemy of Europe. Only 8% see him as a friend.
60% enemy? That's strong. And the Wilders train connection. He's often compared to him, admired him.
Exactly. He's often called the Dutch Trump, has praised him in the past.
Right.
Now, Wilders has apparently been careful not to criticize Trump openly lately, but
the association lingers.
right. And the source analysis suggests this historical and ongoing link could actually backfire on him now. It might make it harder to appeal to voters who are nervous about disruptive political figures or those populist movements that are maybe viewed more negatively given the current global mood. It could damage his support even more.
So it's a complex mix. Domestic struggles, policy failures like the housing plan looking doomed, the internal coalition friction, and then these wider political currents, even connections to figures like Trump potentially working against them.
Yeah, it seems the PVV's first year leading this government formation has been really defined by these multiple challenges. The core question raised by the sources really boils down to, can they adapt? Can they recover their standing after this rocky start? Or will these early problems define their entire term?
And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on, building from the sources. We just talked about how attitudes towards someone like Donald Trump, who isn't directly involved in Dutch politics day to day, could still influence Geert Wilders' support. What does that tell you about how interconnected domestic politics are now? How global figures and feelings might shape things at home, even on issues that seem purely local? Something to think about as you watch how this Dutch government story unfolds.